Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This is a women-only webinar. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools and the media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. Enjoy. So today we are welcoming Julia Long and Lierre Keith, and they will be discussing Julia's book, Anti-Porn, The Resurgence of Anti-pornography Feminism.
Good morning, Lierre. Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Julia.
Hi. So this morning we're going to be talking about my book, Anti-Porn, The Resurgence of Anti-pornography Feminism. Thank you, Lierre. And I just want to say how really pleased I am to be talking about this with you, Lierre, because I really associate when the time that I was researching that book, the time that I was involved in all the activism that I was then talking about in the book, and then writing it, I really associate that time very much with yourself. And as we were saying just before we started, how much I learned from you going to these different conferences and events. And it was, looking back, there was a lot going on, and and it's just great to be talking about it with someone who was very much there and very much shaping it. So
well, thank you. I remember meeting you the first time, so yeah, it was good. Those were some good years in there. I had hope back then.
It certainly did feel very exciting. And that was at one of Gail's conferences. Obviously, Gail has just been in an absolute dynamo, just absolutely her drive and commitment is so impressive, and she really made a lot of those connections possible at that time. So anyway, I'll just begin by saying a little bit about where the book came from. So it was a kind of a write-up, a bit of an amendment, slightly different things to my PhD, but basically a write-up of my PhD that I did from 2007 to about 2011, I think it was. And the reason that I wanted to look into what seemed to me to be this, before I started researching, it seemed to be this resurgence of anti-porn activism within feminism, was even before that, what I'd really started to notice in the culture was the mainstreaming of pornography, obviously the huge expansion of the porn industry, and then how that was influencing and shaping the culture. And it was just something that, even just by seeing the types of advertisements, billboards, things on TV, all the different kind of aspects of mainstream pornography, which was showing how much porn was becoming an influence. And I was originally actually going to do my PhD on that, the whole phenomenon of the mainstreaming of pornography. But I remember speaking with my supervisor, and she was saying, you've got to think about, what you want to do, spend 3 or 4 years doing. And then I heard about some women on a university campus who had a demonstration against Playboy. I don't remember exactly how Playboy was a presence of Playboy had come onto their campus, and they were protesting it. And I thought, oh, this is really good. This is really interesting, and maybe it's part of something wider. So then I shifted my focus onto what this new generation of women doing, saying and doing about it. So that's where it came from. So if Dorothea, can I have the first slide, please? And I'll just give a quick skim over the book, and then we'll get started talking about it. Yeah, so just to give an overview, so there's an introductory chapter which obviously sets out what the book's going to cover, and then the first chapter is a very brief outline history sketch, really, of the development of the women's liberation movement in mainly in the US context and the UK context, and the sort of origins of anti-porn feminism within that context, within those contexts, the various groups that developed in America, and then the groups that developed in the UK, and the things that they were involved in. So that's a bit of a historical contextualization. Yeah, thanks. So the next chapter, I really don't like that. I remember my editor came up with that title for it, and I should have dug my heels in a bit more. I really don't like that, the pornography and the feminist divide, because I don't see it as a divide within feminism. I see it as there's a feminist perspective and there's an anti-feminist perspective, but that's the wisdom of hindsight there. But anyway, that chapter goes through the different frameworks of how different sort of political perspectives on pornography, covering the sort of conservative framing of pornography, the leftist liberal framings, which and Lierre is really, really very good on all this, queer theory and post-structuralist framings of it, and then obviously radical feminists. And then after setting out those frameworks, I look at the main kind of areas of dispute and contention around those. And anyway, I've got a slide on that when we come to that chapter. Chapter 3, Pornification is Discontents, is about the mainstreaming of pornography and how, you know, the phenomenon of both the industry expanding to this global scale in terms of its reach and instant accessibility, and its discontent. So I've included some extracts from interviews then with some of the activists who were involved in this sort of resurgence of anti-porn activism. And then chapter 4 is very much focused on the activism at that time, and what, you know, the kind of campaigns that were going on, what these different groups were doing, and also the perspectives of some of the activists on like what that was all about. And then there's obviously a concluding chapter trying to, you know, draw some of those things together and make a bit of sense of it. So that's that. I think that if we have the next slide, please. Yeah, so I won't dwell on this, but this is a very quick thumbnail sketch of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. These are the kinds of things that I was noticing. If you notice those dates, it's all around the early 2000s, 2004, 2007, 2008. Some of the things that were becoming evident that were getting covered in the mainstream press, and certainly the things that this new generation, it wasn't exclusively a new generation, but a lot of younger women were involved in this sort of anti-porn activism. And these were the kinds of things that were really having such a hugely negative, damaging impact on their lives as they were, you know, getting their first jobs, going out into the world and encountering all of this kind of stuff, the doubling of the number of lap dancing clubs, pole dancing fitness classes, lads mags on the, you know, all over the supermarket shelves, the kind of music videos, things like this horrific, you know, labiaplasty surgery tripling. You know, these are the kinds of things that we were all seeing around us, and that they were very, very keen to do something about. Okay, thank you. So hopefully that sets the scene a bit for what the book was going to be about. Lierre, would you like to talk a bit about this slide? This is from the introduction, the quotes from Rebecca Wisnant.
Yeah, so Rebecca, I know her. She was one of the founding mothers of the Stop Porn Culture group that I was in with Gail, and where I first met Julia. And we had a slideshow, and we went around and did all these trainings. And she teaches philosophy, and she's very smart and very radical feminist. And I highly recommend her anthology, and you should look up Rebecca. Anyway, but I like this quote because she's got ideas about what the movement should be doing, and I like anybody who can sort of lay out some sort of strategy at all is always, I think, a positive thing. So she suggests that we need more people articulating the feminist critique, and particularly in public. Like, it doesn't really do any good to talk about it in our little silos on Facebook or whatever, and it really does have to be public. And it has to involve a very clear feminist analysis that has to counter both the pro-porn and the religious conservative positions, because we have a completely different perspective. If you kind of line up, the the ideas that come from essentially the libertine male left and then the conservative men, they're actually aligned on most things. And the feminist analysis is the one that's completely different. So we need to be articulating that and making that clear to everybody that this is not, either of these things. It is something completely different when you put women at the center of the analysis. And that our critique of porn culture has to be part of a much broader understanding of how everyday life has been commodified. And I think she's very correct in this, and that the left has really fallen down on that. That used to be, I mean, I'm a lot older than some of you. I just turned 60, and I remember when that was a big part of just generally being on the left, that we understood that everything was being taken away and then sold back to us as a very pale version of the real thing. And that just seems to be gone now. It's like social media just has made everything, and we're all living inside the spectacle now. And it's not even a concept that people have anymore, that has been done to us. And so we have to have a non-marketized conception of freedom, because it has to be freedom from all of that as well. And then finally, she wants us to try to imagine and create this alternative reality. So even if all we can do is try to put forward the vision of it, who knows how much we'll get to actually live it, but just some idea of what might be possible, what sexual freedom actually means, what would be a world without rape, without sexual violence. Is any of this possible? What would it feel like to live in that world? And, this was something that back in the day we got to experience, because there used to be all kinds of women-only events that were really big, and you could go for a week and not see any men at all, for 7 days, and only be with women. And the relief that, I know I felt every time I entered one of those spaces, because you didn't even realize like how just, we're all so armored all the time waiting for that next assault, whether it's, a tiny violation, whether it's a great big horrible violation. It's all just violations, and you never know which man's going to do it. You're just walking down the street having your day, and the next thing you know, some man has said something horrible to you, or grabbed you, or terrified you in some way. And we just get used to that, at age 11, 12, 13. It's just how women have to live. And, what did it mean to have these moments of freedom where it's like you get to step away from that burden of all of that, just the constant fear and anger of those experiences are just not there. And so there's that freedom. And so she wants us to encourage, each other in that, that we can imagine freedom, that we might be able to experience little bits of freedom inside patriarchy, and that's how we're going to get to this better world. So I just liked, her sort of the way she laid that out, that we need these three things to make the better world possible.
Yeah, and I remember when I came across that, really liking it as well. And I remember deliberately putting that in the introduction as a bit of a kind of a lens for the reader to think about what was going on then in terms of the activism, and in what ways does it kind of fulfill her vision of the kind of route map that she sets out. I think I would add something to it now, looking back. I mean, she talks about the non-marketized conception of freedom, which I completely agree with, but she doesn't, I don't think I would add something else in about male domination, because it's so much about male domination, and that's a bit of a gap for me looking at that. She doesn't really directly engage with that in her in that route map, but I still think it's I just love her work as a philosopher. I just love how she goes back to thinking about concepts, and just that sort of depth of thought, because a lot of the activism ends up being very kind of a lot of practical organizing. And so I think it's really good to take time to have those much deeper analyses and reflections, the kind of thing that Rebecca certainly brought to it. So Dorothea, can we have the next slide, please? I think this is now going into the first chapter, as I remember. So, Lierre, you selected this. Would you like to say a bit about it, and I can chip in?
Yeah, I like that they laid out these four sort of, the sort of metrics of why we don't like porn. That this is, these are the reasons. And I thought this was done. This was very clear. So for women who were brand new to this would make sense. This would be a way that they could have a lens to understand it. I lost my slide.
Oh, back.
We moved on to another one.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
So just generally, it undermines women's status and our power in the world. It's a form of social control. So we all know what's coming for us if we step out of line. It absolutely works, like all hate speech does, to keep people in line. It's a backlash to the gains that women had been making throughout the 70s and into the 80s. And this is, I mean, the internet has just made this so, I mean, just order of magnitude worse. But the growth in its availability, I mean, even in the 80s, we saw that. And I mean, that just seems like the good old days now. And then it's, the male-defined sexuality and how that's linked to sexual violence. So, women aren't seen as people. All we're seen is as, essentially a set of orifices that exist to service men. And that is the basic message of pornography. So it facilitates and justifies rape, violence, and physical abuse of all kinds. So I thought that was just a very clear demarcation. And I think that this could be, easily accessible to anyone who feels uncomfortable about it and they don't know why. They don't really have a language for it. They know they're going to get called a prude or whatever. Only the cool girls are all into porn with their boyfriends. And so these are the reasons that you don't feel good about this.
Yeah. Yep. Just to give a bit of context to where this comes from. So in chapter 1, where I was tracing the sort of development of the trajectory of the women's liberation movement in both of those, the US and the UK context, and this was the first group that was set up to actually look at and analyze pornography and to really to start doing something about it in the UK. And I know that Sheila was very much an instrumental part of that group. As I recall, I think it was set up, the women set it up around sort of the late 70s, I think maybe 1977, that kind of time. And then they were, very active. You can read about it. There are various accounts of it. I know Sheila has spoken about it. This, I remember I think I got the history from it from a thesis that someone had done about it. But what really struck me when I was going over my interview transcripts was this. It was almost like a direct arrow, was this consistency with the analysis that this anti-porn group in the late 70s had come up with, how they'd looked at the content and come up with this analysis of what it was actually all about, what it was doing as a form of social control of women. And then this, much later generation of women in the early 2000s, who none of whom would have read this, when I was interviewing them about what motivated them to get involved and to start up these groups, it was so consistent. Like the things they were saying was this analysis. So it was just very, very striking to me how consistent that what they were seeing was exactly what had been seen by this earlier generation. So I think the next slide, we're kind of getting onto the different kinds of activities that one of the groups was involved in the back in the day, back in the sort of but maybe by this time it's sort of late 70s, early 80s. So again, would you like to say something about this? This is one that you selected, Lierre.
Yeah, I mean, this was the life I led in the 80s too. So I was like, oh, we used to do these things.
Yeah.
And I just want women to know that, we meant business and we tried all of this. Like we were very brave and we meant it. So we went right for it. So, there was small autonomous groups. This is, in London and Brighton, but I was in the United States and we were doing this here too. I've certainly broken my share of windows. We spray painted. We did posting up flyers and we leafleted, and I have poured cement down toilets. I never threw eggs, but we threw in painted screens, absolutely, and interrupted movies that were showing that glamorized sexual violence. Glued the lock shut. Was absolutely. I mean, I twice was part of a mini riot that destroyed porn stores. We just went in and wrecked the place. And those were like the best days of my life. I mean, it was like such a high point to just to be able to do that even just once in your life was just, I thought the revolution was here. So it was amazing to be able to finally just destroy this stuff. So yeah, we did all these things. And so the angry women, they carried out 19 arson attacks, it says, on different sex shops and sex cinemas. And they ranging from minimal damage to being completely gutted. And luckily no injury to life. Arson is quite serious. There was also a group in Canada that women you could look up, and they started out as an environmental group, and they were called Direct Action. And that was in the very early 80s, and they did some very, very serious damage to things like a hydroelectric dam. I mean, millions of dollars of damage. And again, nobody was hurt, which is always the scary thing when you're dealing with, arson and explosives. They weren't even using like Semtex or C4. It was all just old-fashioned dynamite, and they got that done a few times. And then they went underground and they moved to Vancouver, and then they popped up into public again because they firebombed a series of there were video stores that was called Red Hot Video, and there were all kinds of allegations against Red Hot Video that they were selling snuff films and also child sex abuse materials. And so they firebombed 3 of these places and completely destroyed them. And this was 1982, and I cannot describe to you what that did for my psyche to know that there were women out there doing this. And there were men too in that group. It wasn't a women-only group. They got caught, and they all went to prison, and they were known as the Squamish Five. Oh, and they had renamed their group. The Women's Fire Brigade was the name of the group, and it's WIMMIN. So they went to prison for a while, and then they were all got out eventually. And that was in Canada. One of the women, her name is Ann Hansen, and she has a memoir that I highly recommend that's called Direct Action, which was the name of the first group. And the other woman is Juliet Belmis, and she's went on to be a filmmaker. I got to meet her once, which was beyond cool because she was one of my heroes.
What was her name, Lierre?
Juliet Belmis, Belmas is her name, and she's around. I mean, she's a person. Like you can find her on social media. And she was trying to write a memoir. I don't know that she ever did because I've never seen it. But anyway, these were things that people took very seriously, which they should. I don't mean to be taking arson lightly. I never went that far. Just upfront, I was terrified of hurting people, so I never did it. But I was so happy to know that somebody was treating this like an actual war, and that's the thing. Like, how serious are we about any of this? Well, these people were serious, whether you agree with what they did or not. They certainly knew that it was a war. So, I mean, women did stuff like this. This was in the air, and we read their communiques and we saw them in the feminist press, and it was very inspiring to know that other women felt the desperation of the situation. And I will repeat again, this was long before the internet. We already knew how bad it was.
Yeah.
And that was before the complete takeover of the culture. So that's my little rant about the direct action part.
Yeah, thank you, Lierre. And also, looking right back to the suffragettes, the kind of digging up the golf courses and and the arson and
blowing up buildings and setting
wicket
things on
pavilions
fire
and smashing windows and that kind of thing. But again, no one was injured in no one was well, I think a few men did get thumped. I think the Prime Minister actually at the time got thumped, but no one was injured in the arson. And I think that is really important and significant that it was about
they all tried really hard. Like, I know the suffragists, it was such a principle that no harm is going to come to anyone. But it's hard when you're talking about a fire. Like, how are you going to know for sure? So these are very serious concerns to weigh. I don't want to make light of this at all. This is serious stuff, what all of these people have done. So it's worth a deep think. Whether this is
And again, I mean, I know that Sheila and others, probably women listening, far more knowledgeable about this. They actually were, lived through this era in the different groups, at the time, in a way that I didn't. But this, what I talk about in the chapter, is the group WAVOR in this country, Women Against Violence Against Women, and the activities that they were doing. And then this group, the Angry Women, were obviously this kind of much more
angry
in terms of well, I don't know that they were more angry, but certainly kind of gave vent to it. So it was within the context of a whole, a really, really dynamic and just a very dynamic and driven movement to end male violence against women that from what I remember reading, there were different groups of WAVOR pretty much in every town in the country, in a way. It's interesting, I think now, at the time, obviously, I was looking at the groups in the early 2000s and and comparing, or looking at them in the light of what had happened before. But now, we see things like Let Women Speak, which is basically a similar kind of networking of women in different towns and cities across sort of the UK, and now well beyond that as well, of women getting together and speaking and doing things. So I just think it's interesting, the different shapes that it takes. When I was involved in the early 2000s, it did seem it moved into a much more kind of managed sort of era, where you'll see later on, the kind of activities that we were doing, the groups that were set up, there tended to be it certainly wasn't as direct action as this. It was about raising awareness. There were lots of things that were really creative and very enjoyable, and often very funny, about the kind of things that we were doing, like having these different stunts and things like that. But it was really very different, I think, particularly because one of the groups it was a kind of like, it was a group that was established in quite a formal way, with like a chair and a co-chair and a board of trustees, this kind of thing. It wasn't this direct, although it had a lot of grassroots activists involved. It was something that was just a bit more, like I say, a bit more kind of managed, with strategic objectives and all these kinds of things, and awareness of the media and how things were going to look in the media. It was just really, it wasn't this kind of level of direct action. And I know there were some frustrations about that among some of us at the time. That anyway, so it's interesting to look back at the different kind of forms that it took at different times. Dorothea, can we have the next slide, please? So later on in that chapter, I talk about how this kind of went into a decline, and we can really chart it in terms of the rise of this supposed, what was called at the time third wave feminism, which is basically anti-feminism, or the whole kind of lib fem, oh, it's my choice, lap dancing empowers me, all this kind of thing. And I just like this quote from this the terrible character called Derek Botham, who'd been the editor of Penthouse at the time, and he was actually interviewed on a radio program. And I just think, sometimes you really hear these things straight from the horse's mouth. So that's why I wanted to include this, because I think it really showed how the pressure was taken off of the industry. Obviously, it was a very different industry to what it is now. But so he says, I went through a period, this would have been in the 90s, when I know campaign against pornography in the UK was still very active, in the early 90s, where the feminist movement were blockading just about everything. And I remember going into the offices where I worked and it being picketed by the feminists and things. Now that's all gone. I think everyone accepts now that women will always be thought of as sex objects by men. But the thing about, well, don't treat me as, he's a very articulate character, as you can see. But the thing about, well, don't treat me as a sex object. Well, I'm sorry, love. Everyone is going to. That is life. And that was, I think that was basically, I included that because that was the men's perspective. Once that feminist objection and pressure got basically there just weren't enough women, I think, at the time who were able to sustain it, and that whole pro-porn, sex positive, all of that awful anti-feminist stance really took a hold within feminism. This enabled these terrible men like Derek Botham to basically feel so smug that that is life and that's how it's going to be. So I think that's quite telling. And obviously this is what this younger generation were then responding to, the fact that this was how it had been left. So that's why I wanted to include that. Can we have the next slide, please, Dorothea? So I'll just briefly, this slide just sets out what I was trying to do in chapter 2. In chapter 2, I was very much drawing on Lierre's work, which I hugely benefited from and quoted from. So Lierre had this lovely chart, we've skipped yet, thanks, had this lovely chart, which unfortunately, for formatting reasons, I couldn't get it onto the PowerPoint, but she sets out really beautifully, and I've heard her talk on this many times. She sets out the differences, the really fundamental differences between conservative framing of pornography, the left liberal framing of pornography, both of which see women as men's property, basically, but they differ in the fact, the idea of women being men's private property or men's public property. They see sex as a natural impulse. They see porn unproblematically in terms of this sort of natural impulse. Conservatives think that it's something bad and it should be contained, and the left liberal perspectives means that it's always good, whatever form it takes, and it should be kind of liberated and, you know, within the public domain, etc. So I know, Lierre, you set that out really clearly. I can't remember if you included this in your framing of it, but it felt important to me to include what had then gone on to be taken up with the whole kind of postmodernist queer theory frameworks, which obviously we've seen really how that's played out in more recent years. But the whole idea of sexual minorities and transgression, that kind of idea. And of course, what none of those frameworks do is set out a radical feminist perspective, which takes male domination and male power as being at the heart of what pornography is all about, and then looks at that from a women's perspective of what does this do? How does it what impact does porn have on women, on the lives of women, whether they're the women who are used in the porn or the women who are then having to live with the consequences of it. So those were the basic frameworks, and then I go through a whole series of things that were just constantly coming up in and being very contested particularly between these liberal feminists, anti-censorship feminists, and the whole thing of censorship gets very misrepresented anyway, but they called themselves like the feminists against censorship, this kind of crowd, and the radical feminist perspective. So I look at how both of those two different perspectives frame questions of violence against women, objectification, choice, free speech, the idea that pornography is basically some kind of fantasy, when clearly it's a material reality that is produced and constructed and distributed within the world. And then what was just so dreary, this endless claim about supposed female empowerment. And when I look back on it, I just thought, why did I spend so long actually even talking about this? Because it's so clearly nonsensical. But I think because at the time it just dominated all the discussions. I remember going to different debates and events, and really it was like any hideous thing that men have dreamt up to do to women was getting reframed as being empowering. So I did spend a bit of time, and then this kind of abysmal nonsense of claims around so-called feminist porn, I deal with that at the end of the chapter. So that was what I was doing. And Lierre, I think you selected a couple of sections from that chapter. Maybe we can have a look at. Can we have the next slide, please, Dorothea? Oh, this was a bit about violence against women. Actually, Lierre, would you mind reading that out? I think.
No, sure, yeah.
So that everyone's got a chance to follow.
Sure. The prevalence of pornography within the culture means that, quote, pornographic fictions continue to shape our culture's sexual and social imagination more thoroughly and powerfully than competing discourses can, end quote. For anti-porn feminists, the struggle against pornography is nothing less than the struggle to change the, quote, normal and normative sexual practices of our culture, end quote. Far from being a distraction from the issues of, quote, real violence against women, it is inextricably bound up with the struggle to end the reality of male violence in women's lives. And I thought that was really pointed, because I know one of the things that I just endlessly argued with people about was, well, this is just a symptom. Pornography is just a symptom. You're not actually stopping any real violence against women. This is just a symptom. And I was like, well, then at the end of the day, everything's a symptom, because you've got this massive industry that's just consuming an entire class of women who Andrea Dworkin called the sexually disappeared. You're always going to have these women at the very bottom who have no money, no options, no anything. And that's who ends up in the porn industry. So we know this. And you're just going to keep, eating them alive essentially, and then checking them out when you're done with them. It's quite real to them, that violence. And then, they construct this whole kind of view of women, and this is what a woman is for. And then it of course affects all the other women in the world who have to bump into men who are using this material, whose sexuality is being completely formed by these really horrible ideas about women. So to me, it was like, how can you not see that this is violence against women? It's an entire industry that's literally what it is. They're using women on the one hand to make it, and then on the other hand, there's what happens to all the women because of it, the rest of us in the world. And none of us can get away from it. So that argument always made me so angry that like this is somehow a distraction, that this isn't the real issue. And there was a slogan that Robin Morgan came up with, which was pornography is the theory, rape is the practice. And like she totally nailed it in 1974, but that was, yeah.
And porn is the practice as well. It's
Yes,
the
it
theory
is.
and the
It's
practice.
real women being really used in really horrible ways. Like we can never forget that there's a real woman in that video or in that picture. And this is her life. Like,
yeah, absolutely. And no, it's interesting to hear your experience of that, because that was something that was I mean, some of the literature I was drawing on was from the kind of 1980s, when there were these the same kind of disputes and arguments going on here as well. And it just came up from all of these ones who were basically defending pornography, who were claiming that it was a distraction, which is just, it's just sort of so bizarre to me, because I just think you don't have that argument made in other, in other areas of oppression. So if you're trying to combat racist violence, you don't look at a load of racist material and say, oh, this is all a distraction and we just have to focus on these specific acts. Like anyone who is anti-racism is going to look at all of the literature that supports and endorses racist attitudes. They're not just going to say, oh, that's all a distraction, that's all fine. But do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean the men who were in charge of the Nazi propaganda, that Der Strömer or whatever, their horrible, like some of them were hanged at the like they went before human rights, they went up at Nuremberg, and they were so central to what the Nazis were able to do, by putting out horrendous lies and anti-Semitic cartoons and all the rest of it to dehumanize a whole group of people. And that wasn't even using quote real people. That was cartoons and words. Like pornography is real women. That's what, like my friend Sam Berg always goes, that at the end of Soylent Green, we're like, it's people. She's like, pornography is people.
Yeah,
it's real people being, churned up into this. So
yeah, of course. And I think I must say, as I remember, I really enjoyed writing this. I really enjoyed writing this chapter because these kind of arguments of the claims that they make, they're so easily knocked down. And obviously this whole idea that it's a distraction is very dependent on the idea of, oh, it's just fantasy. And you can so easily, like there's evidence of the reality of it all around us. So I remember.
But even if it is quote just fantasy, which we know it's not, because there's real women involved, but even if it was, why do you want to have fantasies of brutalizing another human being? Like there is something profoundly wrong with people who think that this is somehow liberatory, that torturing people is somehow a fun fantasy to have. I don't fantasize about torturing people. I don't. Like small level, I might fantasize about, I don't know, what I'm going to have for dinner next week with my friends. And big level is like, how are we going to make the world a good place for women? There's not a single fantasy in my brain that's about like kidnapping a human being and doing horrible things to her. This is not a world that any of us want. So why is it okay to have a fantasy that's about these horrendous human rights abuses to other humans?
Exactly.
Like, it doesn't even make any sense on that level. Especially if you're somebody who is trying to make some claim that you're a good person, that you're on the side of justice and righteousness and whatever. How can this be your fantasy life? Why do you think that would be a good fantasy life? And they never
exactly.
want to
Yeah.
answer that question either. Like, why are these good? Why do you think these are good fantasies? Put them on the table. Why is this a good thing to fantasize about?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously that goes, completely. And that goes beyond just this argument about whether it is just fantasy or not, which it clearly isn't. But yeah, exactly. Like, well, why would you defend this? And why, in terms of
Yeah.
the time that you have on the planet, why would you want to spend it in this way? And we know, just with the whole expansion and globalization of the industry, that so many, the statistics of like the number of the porn tube sites and the time spent on it, it's so prevalent. And I think, yeah, that's obviously a question that never really gets asked. And obviously its current incarnation is this there's been a bit of debate I've heard different, like in the press and on the radio in sort of recent months. There have been some concerns. It's usually around the accessibility of pornography to children now. That seems to be like the sort of like the main topic that gets talked about. But even on a radio program I heard, I think it was like sometime last year, where the presenter cited some really grim, like I can't even remember, but some horrible example of pornography, of horrible sexual violence being done to this woman. And then immediately before he even went on to say anything about what the program was about, he said, "Oh well, the last thing I want to do is kink shame anyone." Like that was what this presenter said, and I think that's where it's this whole fantasy thing now. It's now gone into this new vocabulary of kink shaming. And I was just thinking of that when you were saying, like, why would you want to defend it? Like he had just read out this really grim example, and his reaction, and there was a female commentator on it as well, and the reaction of both of them was, "Oh well, we don't want to kink shame anyone. We just, they just wanted to talk about, well, do we want children to access it?" So yeah,
I'm so
yeah,
happy to kink shame anybody. Of course, we should be
it's
telling people this is not a good idea. You should feel shame if you're thinking about torturing people. I'm sorry, but
it's yeah, it's just bizarre, isn't it? It's just really, anyway. So I think we've made the point about that one. So if we can have the next slide, please, Dorothea. Maybe I think this is quite a lengthy slide about choice.
okay.
Um, Maybe everyone can go back and read this. So it's going to take a long time to go through it. But Lierre, would you like to say what struck a chord with you about this slide, if you remember this?
Yeah, let's see.
I think the first,
Okay, so it's about choice. Yeah, that's the thing you're always
it
going
was
to
just,
hear is,
again,
oh,
it
but
was
you're
like
choosing it.
it was like empowerment, wasn't it? It was just like
Yeah.
endlessly choice, choice, choice. It was just like this kind of auto gabble of choice and empowerment. So I think what I do in the first part is to say, like, yeah, this vocabulary of choice is just used to shut down any critique, as if it's the last word on the matter. Oh, this woman chose to do it, and then that's it. So I don't know, maybe do you want to talk about the next paragraph?
Yeah, and then I thought you did a pretty good breakdown about like what is some of the points that are what's wrong with these choice arguments. Because it's even though that individual woman may have quote chosen, I mean you have what were her other options if this was her best option that day? Because you got to admit they're pretty grim if appearing in this video is the best thing she can do today. Um, so there's that, but even putting that part of it aside, like it's not just about that individual woman. How does it affect all of us as a group? And is it helping to maintain male domination of women? So you've got all these questions about the configuration of power, which could not be clearer in pornography. So they tend to overplay women's individual agency, and they just completely depoliticize really all conversations. Because if it's all just about we're all just like these atomized individuals, so we're just freely making choices as if that's in any way how anything works in human society. We know it's not. So it's no different when we're talking about things like pornography, and especially when it's so routine and it's normalized. And the male demand for pornography is really what's behind it. And this is a point that we made at all of our trainings that we did, is this issue about choice is going to come up, and you always have to refocus it on the men. Pornography is not about women's choices. It is about men's choices. It is male demand that produces this entire class of women who have to do this to put bread on the table. It is about male demand. That is why these horrible images exist. It is why there's this vast industry for it. It is because what men are choosing. It is not because women woke up one day and said, oh, I want to do degrading things in front of millions of people. It's because men demanded it and women are poor and powerless. That's why porn exists. So you always have to refocus it onto men's choices. Get it off the woman, because she's the victim here, more than any of us. So yeah, so that was one thing that we always tried to say, but I just thought you broke that down really well.
And also, like, often it would be the kind of socialist feminists, or what, the groups that have been sort of the socialist feminists back in the 80s and 90s, and then obviously the liberal feminists sort of by the 2000s, who'd be making this sort of argument. And I just think it's so funny that they came from this sort of socialist informed perspective, and I don't remember like with Das Kapital, like Marx's work just being rejected because, oh well, that worker just chooses to go to the factory, so it's just fine. It's they had a structural analysis and then they just refused to apply it
apply it to women ever.
Yeah,
it's so bizarre.
Yeah.
There was one woman that she had a long history and had sort of been in the sex industry for a while and blah blah, and she was like really right on the verge of sort of that breakthrough moment of realizing just how horrible all of this had been, which I know was a long journey for a lot of women, and especially considering what she'd been through. But the moment that I saw it break in her eyes, I said to her, because she was still on this sort of empowerment kick, which I understand psychologically a lot of women have to do in order to survive what they've been through. I understand where it comes from for them. But I said to her, there's a huge difference between being like having actual power and getting attention from the people who have the actual power. And it was like her face just broke right open. Like, can you say that again? I'm like, yeah, there's a huge difference between getting attention from the people who have the power and actually having some power yourself. And that was it. Like, she never. Then she went on and read Andrea Dworkin. Like, that was the moment that she understood what had happened. So that's it right here. It's all we're doing is getting attention from people in power. That is no kind of power for women.
And getting really horrible attention that completely dehumanizes you and wants to violate you. So
it's not even like a respectful kind of attention where it's like, oh well, at least I'll pretend I love you or something. This is like horrendous attention where like you're on the verge of being strangled, every 5 minutes. So
yeah. Okay, can we have the next slide, please, Dorothea? Oh my gosh, we've only got 10 minutes, so let's get on to hearing from the women. But I will just say a bit about this. In chapter 3, I look at the mainstreaming of pornography, and this absolutely horrible image was from an advertisement at the time. This image for some kind of makeup moisturizer. But I mean, look at that. I just thought that was the kind of thing that we were talking about, how something that was just so violent and degrading and misogynist in porn had then become part of a really mainstream advert that you could see in a woman's magazine. So I talk about how these things become normalized and then just become part of mainstream culture, and I just thought that that particular illustration just shows that so very clearly. But I remember,
and it's such a ridiculous image. Like, nobody puts on moisturizer like that. It's so obviously she said something squirted on her face. Like, you put it a little bit on your hand and then it never looks like that.
I mean, that was just one in particular, but there were all these different advertisements that were basically doing the same thing, like a hot dog or hamburger advert that was like referencing fellatio. There was ice cream adverts. There was just so many of them, but it was just showing how, far from this sort of like realm of fantasy, the most viciously and violently misogynist acts from pornography were not just accessible in pornography, but they were just becoming a very normal kind of currency within the culture. So can we go on I think we'll have time just to look at some of these. I really wanted to these were the activists that I was interviewing about the activism that they were involved in. So maybe if I can just read through this, because I remember they were so brilliant, these women, and I keep getting these pop-ups that's getting in the way. They were just so brilliant in terms of, oh, can we go back, please? In terms of talking about how it was affecting their lives. So this young woman woman of 25 said, in the 90s, with the boom of porn, it was just everywhere. There was no escaping it. On TV, at home, at work, in the newsagent, school, university, everywhere. And there was no counter argument about it. No one saying anything against it, apart from religious groups. I feel this culture, in inverted commas, has been imposed on us violently. We've been bombarded for 2 or 3 decades with these images. Speaking for myself, the consequences have been very negative, damaging even. I do not know what my sexuality would have been like had I not been exposed to these images. I feel a part of my identity has been stolen from me, and I don't think I can ever get it back. And then Belinda, these were pseudonyms. I use pseudonyms to protect their their anonymity because they were speaking so personally. This Belinda, who was only 23, said that she was talking a very kind of about her own experience. She said, if I was in a newsagent's, I'd start flicking through these men's magazines, and I went through a stage where I was crying when I saw that stuff. This was all the lads' mags. This was all supposed to be so ironic and humorous, and all these lads just having a laugh. She said, where I was crying when I saw that stuff because it was just so heartbreaking to me, because it just made me feel disgusting. It makes me feel like nothing. It's just page after page of hatred. And then final quote here. There were lots more in my PhD and some more in the book as well, but the final quote on this slide. How women were just surrounded by all this imagery, but also by the attitudes of all these men at the time. My ex-boyfriend and his friends openly sexually objectified women in my presence. Comments like, I'd fuck it, and look at the jugs on that, were commonplace. He once told me my breasts were saggy and suggested my labia needed altering. I went on to spend time online researching labiaplasty surgeons. Such was the powerful effect his comments had on my self-esteem. Isn't that just so? Those were the kinds of experiences and these young if we have the next slide, the women talk about how they were so silenced from the dominance of this pornified culture and these horrible men. I remember most of the activists were young heterosexual women who came to the activism because of the attitudes of the men that they were trying to have these relationships with. And there was so much about how you couldn't give any kind of objection to this, and certainly you couldn't say you were feminist because everyone would either laugh at you or sneer or whatever. So, I mean, I've got a lot of hassle for saying that I think that the normalization of pornography is wrong. Culture and society has told girls that they should impress boys, and going against that would just be like social suicide. I think that's a really important phrase, social suicide. We can see everyone's scared to speak up first because they're scared of being labeled a prude. So it's interesting now that everything has shifted so much to the whole kind of assault on us through transgenderism and gender identity, that I think these kinds of things about, there's a similar kind of silencing about, being a TERF, but this was so strong at the time, this silencing of feminist perspective. That's why I wanted to include that, and we've barely got time really to look at the activism. Did you want to say anything about these?
Just that it really is very traumatizing to come to consciousness as a feminist, especially in a world where the misogyny is completely eroticized and so utterly normalized, and it is really, really hard to have to deal with, to learn about pornography and to have to just come to grips with where we are on this planet is really hard. So I completely understand these women who are crying as they're looking at it, and it's you have to have a soul of steel to get through this. It extracts a price on all of us, for sure.
And then, like, what I remember in the interviews, and certainly what I remember from the activism, was it was like this really kind of explosive energy that as these young women were finding each other and finding spaces where they could talk about it, and and realize, you know, the whole consciousness raising of realizing, oh, I've had that experience, and yeah, I hate that as well, and this happened to me in work. That just, you just get this explosive energy, don't you, and laughter, and you know, it really transforms that silence. And one of the interviews I didn't include here, but I always remember, was this woman said, it's just so fantastic to find I'm not the only one, and other women think like this. And she talked about how she would miss her stop on the tube, you know, like on the London Underground, like going back, because they would just be talking in such an animated way, so relieved to have found each other. And then they'd be missing their tube stops because they, you know, so it just was such a transformative thing for them to be involved in this activism. I think the next slide just gives a thumbnail sketch of some of the groups and the campaigns that we were all involved in. Yeah, so these were the ones. There was the Bin the Bunny anti-Playboy campaign, F off Hef, which was when they opened the new Playboy club after like however 30 years it had been closed in London, and then they reopened it. And so that was a big demo, the F off Hef demo outside this new Playboy club that got a lot of media attention. Stripping the Illusion was the anti lap dance campaign, or the campaign to, it was quite a reformist to have the licensing laws changed, so because they were just springing up all over the place. And Feminist Fridays were the Lads Mags campaigns. So these were the kinds of things. I remember lots of the humor in terms of the kinds of stunts, the kinds of songs, the actions, very, very energizing, and yeah, and did actually succeed in changing the law in some important ways. Is that your dog, or can I hear you snore?
Yes, I'll wake her up a little bit. She's really loud. She's none of the others snore. She is such a snorer, and she sleeps so deeply. I'm like shaking her to wake her up.
No,
come on, Parker, get up.
No, leave her. Let sleeping dogs lie. That's what I thought. We've managed to send someone to sleep anyway with all this talk.
Get to sleep on my lap here. The Bin the Bunny ones were really funny. I remember some of those, the little videos they made. If anybody can find those online, they're worth looking at because they were hysterical.
They're still online. I found them when I was researching the talk. It was, yeah.
Where there's like somebody dressed up as a rabbit or whatever, and the rabbit's like, oh, totally horrified by what Playboy bunny. It's just they're very cute.
And do you know, Lierre, I've still got that white rabbit costume here. Every now and then when I have a sort out, I find it, and at one point one of the paws got separated from the rest of it, and I was sorting out this filing cabinet, and I was really alarmed to find this big rabbit. So yeah, so if anyone wants to revive, I've certainly got a few resources on hand that we could do that with. But I noticed unfortunately we've pretty much run out of time. But any reflections now, Lierre, on, you know, we were both saying before the talk on, like, you know, this was what we were so involved in at the time, and now we're just fighting to defend the meaning of the word woman.
I just am so bitter about this point, especially. It's like, I used to have a life where I was doing useful political work, where I really, really wanted to do something about this industry. And it felt like we were getting somewhere because we had the Swedish model or the Nordic model, whatever you want to call it. Then Iceland, all that cool stuff happened in Iceland. I was like, maybe there's a way. We had the Dworkin McKinnon ordinance. Maybe there's some version of that we can like really make some structural change here, make pornography harder and harder for men to get to. Try to shift the culture enough that people understand that it's human trafficking, it's violence against women, it's horrendous stuff, whatever. And what happens then? I have spent the last 2 decades of my life just essentially, 15 years anyway, explaining to grandmas where babies come from, is what it comes down to. That's all we get to do now, is just fight this ridiculous stuff about, oh, anyone can be a woman. No, they can't be. You cannot be a woman because you declare you are. This is so insane that we are stuck with this. And this is where all of our energy has to go now, because it just feels like the primary emergency. And I don't know about you, but the rest of my life got canceled. So I don't have a choice about what I'm doing now. I just have to fight these people. But I would really, really like to get back to what I was actually put on this planet to do. You know, this industry just gets worse and worse. And there's just no time every day to do anything about it. All I can do is fight this ridiculous, you know.
But one thing that did strike me when I was going back and, you know, thinking back over these times was the women were the women that I was meeting through this activism at the time, generally speaking, were about sort of 10, 15, 20 years younger than me at that time. And I was like probably in my what was I, like in my mid-40s, something like. But something that does strike me was that everything gets talked about as this kind of resurgence, and that like now everyone's like, a lot of the women who were involved in the, for want of a better term, I'm just going to call it the so-called gender critical movement, that, you know, the defending what a woman is movement. A lot of these women weren't around for that era that we were around with, or certainly not for the, well, maybe some of them actually are of an age where they would have been around for the early, for some of the earlier times. But what strikes me now is that the women that I do stuff with, that I'm, you know, meeting through all of this current movement, are generally a much older generation. Not much, but they're generally an older generation. That's a different thing to me. I'm meeting women who are more kind of like in their 40s and older. Not exclusively, there are young women involved, but it seems to be more that demographic. But I think what certainly is emerging again is women's anger, and that does also definitely relate to the pornified culture that we're living in, like absolutely. So I do think that and I know that there is going to be a book, I think hopefully coming out. I don't want to mention her name, she might not want me to, but I've already referenced this before. There's going to be a book coming out which I think really brings the two things together, because obviously gender identity, ideology, and pornography are so linked.
Completely.
And so I think there is maybe this is what we can do now. There can be more of a drive for this synthesis, because I remember at a time a lot of the women who were involved in the anti-porn campaigns were very, very wary about getting involved with the whole like anti-gender identity
that's
because
still a thing.
of being cancelled.
They're going to get cancelled, and they know it.
Now
and they won't talk to us anymore.
Exactly. So there was a real kind of wariness about that. But now I think, especially in this country, things have moved on so much that maybe this is something. It's only really doing this talk has made me think there can be more of a synthesis, because I think women are understanding that these are just very much, it's all different aspects of male domination, and they're actually not really very different at all. They're both coming from the same thing of the objectification of women, and you know, men's sort of determination of, you know, the fetishization of femininity, and, you know, all of that will to violate.
It's a subordination fetish. That's all it is.
Subordination fetish, exactly.
That's all it is. That's what they're doing.
So I don't know. I think so. I think maybe there is that potential for a development there to bring the things together. But I know we've slightly run over time. Lierre, it's been such a
great.
A real joy to talk about this with you, and to
walk down memory lane.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Lierre.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.